Good afternoon, everyone. We're thrilled to be presenting a timely panel entitled Ensuring Access to the Polls, How Lawyers Can Help, sponsored by the ABA Coalition on Racial Justice, the ABA Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, the ABA Standing Committee on Election Law, and the ABA Center for Human Rights. This panel is one of many in a series of rapid response webinars. We are actively planning many more, and we hope that you will check the website americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. And we look forward to having your participation. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of the panelists through the Q&A, not the chat. And then we will try during the webinar to answer at least some of them. And if we don't, we will try at the end to have some time to do that. And I wanted to make one pitch as a matter of personal privilege, and that is the ABA Standing Committee on Election Law, which I chair, and one of our panelists, Bill Kresse, is on, has a program this year called Poll Worker Esquire that encourages lawyers to become poll workers. I know it's getting kind of late, but there is a sort of crisis in poll worker contingents in a lot of states, and it might be worth trying to sign up even at this late date. You can do that by going to canivote.org. That's a website of the National Association of Secretaries of State, which is our partner in doing this work. And they can set you up with your state and see if they need poll workers. I really encourage you to do that. It's sort of an exciting job and one that's particularly well suited to lawyers. And that segues nicely into Bill Kresse's presentation. Bill is a commissioner and secretary of the Board of Elections Commissioners for the city of Chicago. And he has the perspective on this as an election administrator, a job which this year is more challenging than ever. So Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, very good. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
Very good. Yes. In fact, just today, I'm going to make my own plug here. The Chicago Board of Elections has announced, along with the Chicago Bar Association, a program trying to get lawyers into the polling places and working with us. And we'll even pay a lawyer $500, not per hour, that many of you are used to, but from 5 a.m. to past 7 p.m. But
I'm on a plane.
Say again?
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I know. So we're keeping our fingers crossed. So if you're in the Chicago area or Cook County, check with the Chicago Bar Association website on that. Anyway, great to be here. Great to speak to you. As Estelle pointed out, I am a commissioner of the Chicago Board of Elections. There are 3 commissioners. We are, in fact, an independent political organization, governmental entity, separate from the city of Chicago government that runs the elections in the city of Chicago. We are, as I say, independent of the city. We run the elections. But I am also, I have another job. I'm a professor at Governor's State University, just outside Chicago, where my specialty is fraud examination. And being fraud examination and running elections in Chicago just seem to work hand in hand. But in any event, I wanted to talk to you. I've been involved in elections for a very long time. I've been a poll watcher. I've been an election judge. I've been an attorney with the Chicago Board's Election Central, which is our election day hotline. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is what I call the 4 itties of being an effective lawyer on election day. You might wonder, what do I mean by the 4 itties? Well, I even gave myself flashcards. And the first one is authority. Okay. You're an attorney. Now, a lot of folks don't like lawyers. Okay, I hate to say that. Nonetheless, they may even begrudgingly concede that you have authority, okay, that you bring with you a certain air of authority, and that's a good thing, especially for what we're trying to do on election day. And so I would encourage you to realize that, embrace it in the way you act, in the way you dress, okay? And I brought props. I'm sort of the Gallagher of webinar speakers. So I like to bring on election day, I've got my vote tote. Okay, you can see that there. Okay. And if you don't have one of those, then, you know, the ABA briefcase is always a good thing to use as well. But so you want to look like you have this authority, and you don't want, goodness sakes, you don't want to go into a polling place, especially if you're a poll watcher. If you're a judge of election, if you're working there for the election authority, you'll have the appropriate credentials. Maybe they'll give you a name tag to wear, fine. Otherwise, you're walking in, do not walk up and say, I'm a lawyer. Okay, that's going to turn people off. Maybe just walking in with a certain look about you, they'll know. Additionally, I would encourage you to go out and get a name tag, a lanyard, maybe with your business card, or even, you know, get an address label that says maybe the name of the organization you're working for, whether it be the Bar Association or some other committee, your name, and then your title, election observer, election, poll place, a watcher, whatever the title is. So people will know, and not just the people from the election authority, but the voters. The voters will want to know, who's that person behind the table with the election judges? Who, why is that person there? If you wear a name tag or a lanyard or something, you'll immediately show that authority. But again, in keeping with this idea of authority, you're expected to know the law. Now, I'm going to guess that most who are watching this have an interest in election law, but may not be really election law authorities. So in the couple of weeks we have before Election Day, read up on the rules. Okay, now in Chicago, we give each of our election judges the Election Handbook, which is 112 pages long. Okay, there's a lot in there. And we have tried to think of every sort of contingency and have clear instructions on all of it. Nonetheless, questions come up. People maybe didn't read the entire thing. They didn't understand the entire thing. And they're going to be looking to you for the answers. Okay. So read whatever your locality authority has out there. In Chicago, if you get one of these, if you're an election judge, but it's also online, that's anyone in the public can look at the rules. I found in my many years of working on the election board hotline that 85% of the calls I got, I could settle some dispute simply by finding the correct page in the handbook, having them turn to the page, and then reading together what the procedure is. This will settle a lot of disputes. Additionally, you may be required to know about election law. Now, we can't all carry law books in, but I would suggest bring with you, if you have an iPad or something similar, with a link to your state or locality's election rules and election laws. Again, you can look it up then and then show people what the rules are. One other thing that I have found and I've advised people to bring with them is a clipboard. There's nothing like walking around with a clipboard that gives you an air of authority. Okay, whether you carry an open one or a closed one. And I would suggest also before Election Day, print out and keep on the face of that clipboard important telephone numbers for your election authority, your attorney general, U.S. attorney, these hotline numbers that you can call if there's a problem on election day in your particular polling place. Additionally, so that's authority. You are going to, have that authority with you. And that's a good thing. The other the next one, clarity. We have a lot of rules, and some of them seem silly. And sometimes people don't understand. Maybe we don't understand. Why do we have that rule? Look it up, research it. Think about this again before election day. Why is it like in Illinois, we have what we call the campaign-free zone, 100 feet outside the entrance to where the voting takes place. There can be no political signs, no people supporting a candidate, handing out things, whatever. They have to be at least 100 feet away. Why is that? Well, it's to prevent voter intimidation when they're going in to cast their vote. We have a rule in Illinois, and some states have it, and some have had it overruled by courts. So know what the law is in your place about taking selfies of yourself casting your ballot, marking your ballot. Why is that illegal? Well, it goes back, in Illinois to a practice where your boss, maybe your union boss, maybe your political boss would say, I want you to vote for this candidate and I need you to prove it to me. Take a picture of yourself with your ballot. Okay. So that's what, so try to understand these things. So when someone has an issue, a beef, you can rationally, calmly explain it to them. Okay. My next creativity. We will be called upon. You'll be amazed how creative you'll need to be in a role as a poll watcher or as an election judge. Again, we've got 112-page manual. We've tried to think up of every contingency, but undoubtedly something's going to happen that's going to be, you're going to have to come up with something new. One time when I was working the elections in Chicago, down at the Board of Elections, we got a call from a polling place where the scanner that the voters put their ballots in went down. By the way, just an example, here is an example of a ballot in the city of Chicago, okay? There's a ballot, see how long that is? That's page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, okay? So people take 10 minutes trying to fill this thing out, and now they want to put it in the scanner and leave. The scanner is broken. We have a line waiting to get to the scanner. Aha, we're prepared. In our book, we have built into our carrier an alternative or a standby ballot box that they can put it in. The problem is in transporting, the trucking company damaged it and it couldn't keep the door on. They send me out there and my instructions were figure it out, okay? So first person I saw coming in to the polling place was the maintenance man. And I said, do you have an empty cardboard box, a roll of duct tape, and some black Sharpies or markers? He didn't have the Sharpies. The election people had Sharpies. I configured out of that cardboard box and a penknife, a ballot box. We taped it closed, had the judges initial the edge of the tape, taped it down to the table, had them initial it, and that became the ballot box. Sometimes you have to, exercise those creative muscles in your mind. But in preparing for an election, again, be prepared for what might happen. For one thing, pack your lunch, okay? It's going to be a long day. Pack a lunch. And I would also suggest, people get that 3 o'clock, rumbling in their stomach. Bring a box of candy. Frango mints are my favorite. But keep it hidden until 3 o'clock. Bring it out. Everyone will love you. Okay. Of course, you're going to have leftover Halloween candy. Bring a bag of that as well. Okay. One of the things that often comes up at polling places, again, you have that 100-foot campaign-free zone. I have a 100-foot tape measure. I also have a smaller one that's 50 feet. Bring that and a piece of sidewalk chalk to mark the sidewalk where that line is so that you don't have any problems with that in the future. But again, be prepared. Again, bring the duct tape. Bring a small flashlight. You'll probably be starting at 5 in the morning. You may be leaving well after 7 at night. It's going to be dark. Might need a flashlight. Secondly, power can go out. Something falls underneath a voting booth. You need a light to go see it. So bring a small flashlight. Okay. And okay, that's some of my props. Okay, and some of my tips. Another itty that we have, and this one, tranquility. In other words, be a peacemaker. The passions for this election are very high. Don't you contribute to it. Let's take it peacefully. We will fight when necessary to protect the integrity of the vote, but be a peacemaker. As a young lawyer, I was a law clerk to a federal judge here in Chicago who was renowned by the name of Abraham Lincoln Moravitz. As you might tell from his first two names, his chambers were filled with Lincoln memorabilia. As you might have guessed from his last name, he was Jewish. But on a shelf in his chambers, next to the conference table where we'd have, pretrial conferences and settlement conferences, he kept a framed copy of the Prayer of St. Francis. And many of you may be aware of that. And it begins, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace." And he would tell attorneys, we as lawyers, we're in a unique position to be peacemakers. Yes, we need to zealously advocate for our clients, but we don't have to be jerks about it. So be a peacemaker. Try and settle things out. Work it out. Okay? In the end, we'll all be better. Our democracy will be stronger if we realize that even if we have differences, we can work things out. Okay? And my last itty, I'm going to toss in a fifth one. Integrity. Walk into the polling place with it, but make sure you walk out with it too. That's the tips from Professor Fraud, Commissioner Fraud, not Commissioner Fraud, Commissioner Kresse, and most proudly, Attorney William Kresse. Let's have a good election out there, folks. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was not only entertaining, it was very informative. Obviously, Bill has a perspective as an election administrator. I just want to clarify one or two things. Everybody calls these things differently, right. But an election judge, which he referred to several times, is what we call a poll worker in a lot of states. Correct. Which means the person in the front of the room who checks you in when you go in to vote. So they are an official at the polling place. There are other people he referred to, like people outside, sort of checking on things and whether there's any problem of people getting too close to the polling place, for example. Those are often called outside observers. And then there are inside observers who we call poll watchers. So now that I've confused you totally, let me turn it over to Michelle Bishop.
The important thing is understand what your local rules and laws and authorities use and understand those rules as well. We're all a little different.
Understand what your role is as opposed to somebody else's, because that can change a lot of things and can get you into trouble if you're in someone else's lane. Okay, I'll now turn it over to Michelle Bishop. Michelle is the Voter Access and Engagement Manager at the National Disability Rights Network. So obviously she sees things through the lens of access in a way not everyone does. So we're going to have her take on things next. Thank you, Michelle.
Hi, thank you for having me. As you heard, my name is Michelle Bishop. I'm with the National Disability Rights Network, or NDRN. That's really important because we are a national membership association for disability rights organizations that are federally mandated. They're in every state, district, and territory in the US. In fact, there are 57 of us, one in each of the 50 states. DC, each of the 5 territories, and if you're thinking that's only 56, you are correct. The 57th is actually in the Southwest and represents specifically Native Americans with disabilities. That's going to be really important later on. So you just hold on to all of that. I want to talk a little bit. I'm so sorry. My fall allergies have kicked in with a vengeance in October. So I apologize for the coughing. I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we anticipate for voters with disabilities going into this election, or some of the things we've actually already seen during the primary season, as well as early voting, now that it's underway, that we think could be really, really problematic on general election day when we expect really our highest turnout. And then I'll shift gears a little bit and talk about what your role could be in helping to make sure it's a smooth election day for all voters, but especially for voters with disabilities. So a few of the things that we're seeing and anticipating, first and foremost, fewer polling places and different polling places than what we've seen in the past. There's very good reason for that. It's essentially related to COVID-19. A lot of the locations that are traditional polling places are locations that we simply can't use this year because of the pandemic. Nursing homes and long-term care facilities were actually common polling places and good polling places. They tended to be a little more accessible than your average location. And it also made it really easy for the residents who live there to be able to vote because they just have to be able to get to the lobby or the community room or whatever it may be. But those locations really can't afford to throw their doors open to the public this year and risk the safety of their residents. We're seeing a similar effect with some other locations like schools, especially if those schools are open or considering opening in the near future. Same thing, they've got to keep those students safe. So a lot of polling locations, which are, it's a completely voluntary gig, are unable or unwilling to serve this year. And the consequences of that, fewer polling places mean more congestion at the polls. It could also mean polling places that are really far away. And if you're a voter with a disability who, related to your disability, cannot drive, if there's not reliable, accessible public transit in the area, which would cover most of the United States, it could be harder to get to those polling places for any voters, but especially for voters with disabilities. Those different polling places are also a bit of a mixed bag. We've heard about some more accessible locations being used, especially when we start talking about really high capacity voting centers like stadiums. They're designed to get a lot of people in and out. They tend to be flat and have big wide entryways and elevators and ramps and all sort of things that are great for accessibility. But it's really unclear how accessible most of the polling places we're seeing are going to be on election day, given that some of our really accessible locations aren't able to serve this year. So we anticipate some difficulty there. We're also looking at, and I think we've seen good evidence for this, I'll say. Wisconsin particularly decided to move forward with an in-person primary earlier this year, really sort of at the height of COVID-19, and Milwaukee, which is supposed to have, I'm going to say off the top of my head, 188 polling places, somewhere right around there, just under 200, had 5. That's a huge barrier. First of all, getting to those 5 locations, it's going to be further away for some, but also just the type of congestion and the long lines that we saw, something we just can't afford to do again this November. We're also concerned there's going to be fewer and less experienced poll workers. I know everyone makes jokes every year about the average age of poll workers. I find it a little cruel. I know poll workers skew older, but that doesn't mean that they aren't fantastic at their jobs. I wish our poll workers got a little more credit. They work really hard. But what could be challenging about that in 2020 is that if we're looking at poll workers who are a little older in years, that also makes them in that high risk pool for complications related to COVID-19. So a lot of our poll workers, our really tried and true poll workers, are unable to serve this year. That does mean shortages that are difficult to fill. It also means that the amazing folks who are stepping up and willing to serve as poll workers this year probably haven't sat through as many poll worker trainings or worked as many election days and just don't have that bank of experience. And that can make a really big difference when we talk about voters who have disabilities, because those seasoned poll workers have worked with the voting equipment before. They know how the accessible voting machines work. They also know what types of accommodations voters and is entitled to, what they can and can't do when they're ready to provide those types of accommodation. Things that can be a little confusing for a newer poll worker. And also, you know, in some of those smaller polling places, especially in, you know, small towns where folks know each other, they know when certain voters arrive what types of accommodation they need, and they're ready to provide it. So having fewer poll workers, newer poll workers can really have an impact there just on how smoothly things run on election day and how prepared voters need to be to come kind of ready to advocate for themselves and push for the access accommodations that they need. We've been talking all year, taking a good hard look at vote by mail. Vote by mail, understandably, is such a key issue this year because of the pandemic. It makes a lot of sense. For people who are immunocompromised or high risk for COVID-19, it can help them to reduce their exposure by being able to vote from home. For people who are positive for COVID-19, who have a mail ballot, they'll be able to stay away from the polls and not risk the safety of anyone else who's there voting that day. But traditional vote by mail systems are not accessible to people with disabilities because they're exactly what they sound like. It's a piece of paper that comes to you in the mail. You have to be able to read it and hand mark it to be able to vote that ballot. And for so many people with different types of disabilities, that's just not a reality. If you're blind or low vision, you can't necessarily read that page. People who have limited manual dexterity or no use of their hands can't pick up a pen to be able to mark that page. That hand-marked paper ballot just isn't a reality for so many voters. There are a lot of states, and the number is increasing, where you can receive your ballot electronically. So you can use whatever technology you have at home to make that ballot accessible to you. You can mark it on your computer, your tablet. If you have, a screen reader or whatever it may be that's hooked up to that tech, you'll be able to mark that ballot. In some places, a lot of them, as a matter of fact, you at some point have to be able to print out that paper ballot and return it, which is a barrier in itself. That printed ballot is still inaccessible. And let's say I'm a voter who's quadriplegic and I use my computer to mark my ballot, but I don't have any movement from the neck down. Once it rolls off a printer, I'm not sure what I'm doing with that page, right? So we see some inaccessibility still in the system and some other concerns, like not everyone owns a printer. I don't know about you guys, but I've been home since March and I don't own a printer. Some of those other things that we're taking a look at. In some states, this is also still very much up in the air. A lot of states that have added accessible vote by mail systems have done so because they've been sued. And so there's been a lot of back and forth litigation as cases are getting appealed. A lot of it's still up in the air. So we don't necessarily know how accessible vote by mail systems may be going through the rest of this election cycle. There's also just some of the basics of voting by mail that could be a bigger barrier this year than they are traditionally. Having to have a witness sign that ballot. Some states require up to 2 witness signatures. Some states require a notary. And some actually require, if you are voting absentee because you have a disability, that you have a doctor's note attesting to your disability. That one I find to be a bit of a barrier just in general. But when we talk about people who are immunocompromised, accessing the doctor, the notary, those witnesses is a risk. When we talk about people who have COVID-19, they're putting those people at risk. So some of those rules have been relaxed in a number of states, but that also varies. Some are really sticking to their guns. You're still going to have to have a notary. Some you aren't going to have to meet any of these requirements. And some I've even heard said, you usually have to have 2 witness signatures, but you can have 1. Which I guess is a little bit helpful, but maybe not as helpful as I'd like it to be. So some of the rules around absentee voting, I think, are a bigger barrier in 2020 than they have been in the past, but they're also changing a lot as well. The last thing I'll mention that's disability specific, we're also looking at curbside voting. In the majority of states, if you can get to your polling place, but you can't get in because it's not accessible to you, the ballot will be brought out to you. And a lot of states are kind of stepping up and beginning to offer curbside voting if they haven't before, but there are still many places where it's not a reality. When we're looking at fewer and different polling places, curbside voting could actually be immensely helpful to make sure that those locations are still going to be accessible, especially if they're brand new locations we haven't used before. It's also going to help limit your exposure if you're someone who is immunocompromised, when you're able to stay in your vehicle and just interact with maybe a couple poll workers who are wearing their PPE. And something I haven't heard discussed very much at all that I think is really important, people who test positive for COVID-19, who are otherwise eligible voters. If you test positive after the deadline to apply for a mailed ballot, you're still an eligible voter, allowing those voters to show up with a mask on, stay in their vehicles, interact with a couple poll workers who are wearing PPE is arguably probably the safest way for those voters to be able to cast their ballots. Honestly, that looks a lot like a COVID testing site in my mind, right? That we're operating all the time. I haven't been to one yet. I have not gotten the swab. I've heard it's not fun, but over quick, right? But that kind of curbside voting model really kind of replicates what we're doing with COVID-19 testing sites that could be really powerful. In some states like Arizona and Alabama, it's actually still being litigated. So the extent to which it'll be available, we're still unsure. And I guess that kind of takes me into some of the broader concerns I think we have about this election day overall that aren't necessarily specific just to voters with disabilities. When we look at changing rules and changing deadlines, I think that can generate a lot of confusion and apprehension for voters. They're not sure what their options will be, and they're not sure what they're required to do to have those options, right? What is the deadline for applying for my mailed ballot? Does it have to be received by election day or postmarked by election day? In some states, that's still being litigated, and we don't actually know what the answer is going to be. I think one of the most important things we can do in the midst of all of this is just to help calm the fears and the anxiety that some voters are going to have when we're in a really shifting and an uncertain landscape. And the other thing we're really starting to talk about a lot is that we may not know who the winner is on election night. And I don't know much about you guys, but I like to know who the winner is basically immediately. I do this for a living. I work on the election all day on general election day. By the time we get to like 8 o'clock at night, I've been up since 4:30 and thought about nothing about this election all day. I want those results immediately. But I realize how unhealthy that is. I realize I'm part of the problem because it takes time to count those ballots, count them accurately, certify those results. And with so many more people voting by mail, it could potentially take even longer. Or with this election being so heated and uncertain, a lot of elections officials are going to really take the full 10, 14 days that they have and do a good job counting those ballots and get those results certified before they really start releasing results. And I think we could do a lot to let voters know that that's a good thing. That doesn't mean anything's going wrong. That means we're just doing our job well and we want it done right. Conversation just worth having if you get the chance. But okay, I brought up a whole bunch of problems, right? A whole bunch of scary things, things we're not quite sure how they're going to go on November 3rd. So what can you do about that? Love some of the suggestions I've already heard. Be a poll worker, be a poll watcher, do all of those things. Oh my gosh, we need poll workers, sign up. One other opportunity for you, I mentioned that I work all day on election day on this election. That's because I'm part of the national headquarters for the Election Protection Coalition. That is a phone number you've probably heard before, 866-OUR-VOTE, OURVOTE. That hotline is actually live now for early voting, and it'll be live through poll close, the time the very last polls close, late in the evening on November 3rd, that voters can call if they have any questions about voting. Something as simple as what type of ID do I need, or where's my polling place, up to I'm at my polling place right now and I'm being denied my right to vote and I need assistance. We really need lawyers for this type of thing. We rely primarily on attorneys and law students, if anyone else here is a professor who's got some students that may be interested, to help field those calls. Something Bill said is so true. If you've got the materials in front of you, there's a lot you can resolve right there, especially for voters who just aren't as versed in these laws as the rest of us are. So many of those calls, you get that satisfaction right there of helping to answer someone's question or helping them to advocate. And anything that's more complicated is kind of going to get bumped up to an election protection war room that's really going to go to bat for that person. We get to do some amazing things. There are attorneys who, through this coalition, have actually gone into court on election day to do things like keep the polls open later in states where there have been problems and things like that. It can be incredibly rewarding. If you go to 866ourvote.org, there's still opportunities to sign up and volunteer there. The last thing that I would add to all of that, I really want to stress, I gave like a hint that this was coming when I started talking, that we have a national network of disability rights organizations. They're mandated through the Help America Vote Act to ensure access to the vote for people with disabilities. So if you're really interested in this, you want to do more with it, or you want to know more, or you're looking for somewhere to refer a voter with a disability, you should absolutely use that organization as your resource. They may very well be looking for volunteers. A lot of them also run their own hotlines on election day or go out and survey polling places for accessibility on election day and could really use your help. But they'd also, I'm sure, appreciate it if anytime you have a question about access for voters with disabilities or a voter with a disability who needs assistance, that you get in touch with them, and they'd love to work with you and with those voters. The easiest way to find our affiliate, no matter where you are, is to go to ndrn.org. It's the National Disability Rights Network. So it's ndrn.org, and there is a link in the top left corner that says something like find your PNA or find the PNA in your state. It's short for Protection and Advocacy. So they'd love to help you. And that is everything I've got. Estelle, take it away. Oh, I think
I thought I was experienced enough to unmute at the right time, but I guess not. You can never be too experienced in Zoom calls, I guess. So our next panelist is Jennifer Lamirand. Jennifer is the director of the Oklahoma City office of Crowe and Dunlevy, a very large and important law firm. Actually, there was a president of the ABA who comes from that firm, Bill Paul, and he was terrific. And she is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and serves as an associate justice on the Citizen Potawatomi, did I say that? Potawatomi Nation Supreme Court. So she's got a lot of hats too, and we're really looking forward to hearing from Jennifer. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. As mentioned, I am a director at Crowe and Dunlevy, and I am an Indian law and tribal law attorney, as well as being a tribal justice. So I'm really here to offer some thoughts about different barriers that we see to voting and participation in Indian country, and some ways that you all can help if you see one of these obstacles that maybe you can help address in your own communities. For those of you that live and work in and around Indian country, it might help to know some of these traditional challenges that we face. There is some overlap with what has already been talked about, but also some unique things. So I'm going to talk about common obstacles. But before I do that, I do want to make sure that everyone recognizes that in the United States, we currently have over 570 federally recognized tribal governments and groups, and also many non-federally recognized tribal governments and groups. And each of these communities is different. Some of them are urban, some of them are rural. Some of them have reservation lands, others do not, and will have individual tribal lands or individually owned restricted lands. Every community is different, just like every state is different, and some of these obstacles are not faced by all tribal citizens in every community. Others are faced to an even greater degree. So keep that in mind as you hear some of these. I do also want to recommend that you look for more information on this topic if you have a really deep interest on the website for the Native American Rights Fund. They have done an extensive report on different obstacles that face Native American communities and citizens in participation in the electoral process. And they have a summary of that report. They have a full report. They have all sorts of resources you can look to. That's really a good place to dig into this if you have an interest. So now for common obstacles. Some of these things we've talked about, but others we haven't. First up, remote locations and making it difficult to travel to polling locations. As I mentioned, some Native American communities exist in very rural areas and some exist in urban areas. Many traditional reservation lands and blocks of reservations are still a little bit isolated from large urban areas where you might find the polling places. And there also has not traditionally been a lot of consideration about carving up different voting districts to make travel to polling places for Native American communities very easy. Even if you have travel times that seem like they're accomplishable in a reasonable amount of time, you also need to consider some of these rural areas do not have well-developed roads that will make access really easy. Of course, you also have tribal citizens that may also have a difficulty in accessing different types of transportation. So you don't always have the same ability to hop on a bus or other type of transport to get from your rural area into the polling place. We have precinct confusion. This was already touched on a little bit already, but even more so for tribal communities because we have this legal pluralist society in tribal areas, even more so than you see in other parts of the United States, where you have multiple different governments layered on each other with different interactions. Many of these tribal communities have their own governments and their own elections. You have polling places that tribal citizens use for those tribal elections. Sometimes that polling place is not the same as the polling place that's going to get used for elections for state, county, federal elections. So this can cause confusion in addition to the barriers we're seeing this year with the shutting down of polling places, the changing up of polling places because of staffing. All of those issues can cause confusion about where tribal citizens need to go to access the polls. Language barriers, much as that which has already been discussed. In Native communities, you still have some tribal citizens that speak Native languages. They don't necessarily have materials ready at hand in order to translate ballots or procedures or even information about candidates. They may not have access to the internet, which I'll talk about in a second, in order to try to get some resources to translate items. And they may not have the ability to call on someone in their close family relationships that can help with that. Lack of resources and funding put into voter education. Again, many of these communities have not had a lot of funding or education about participation in the electoral process. And this can lead to a whole population of tribal citizens that do not have the information they need to successfully participate. This goes for all areas of participation, from voter registration to polling places to information about candidates and different issues. So this lack of resources, as I mentioned, can also extend to internet access. In some of these rural locations, we are really pushing to get more internet access, particularly in COVID times, for houses and different community centers on reservation or tribal lands. This is still an ongoing process. And some citizens don't have the ability to just hop online, check where they need to go for their voter registration, check what registration they have active, or check their polling place. So this can also be a difficult time for them to find these types of resources or information, particularly if tribal community centers and other places where they might access internet are not open at this time because of the ongoing pandemic. Distrust of the system and the government. I think many on this call may know that due to the histories of interactions between Native communities and federal and state governments, there can be some level of distrust in state and county and federal government processes. And some of this distrust even extends to tribal governments, so it's not exclusively for federal and state governments. It can be general distrust of the system. And this can lead to a feeling that a tribal citizen may not be compelled or motivated to participate in the electoral process outside of tribal elections. It takes resources and education in order to change that view and to really emphasize that federal, state, county, local elections can directly impact tribal citizens in their communities. And that, again, is an ongoing process that continues to develop. But some of these communities right now may still have some of that level of distrust, especially across generations. Another particular obstacle that you might see in Native communities is untraditional addresses. So again, in these rural areas, if you have them, then you may have rural post addresses. You may have groups of families that will just access one PO box at a common place together and do group trips to drop off or collect mail. One person might say, hey, I'm going to go into town today to check mail. And they may go check the post office for a number of different PO boxes or a number of people that use the same PO box. We also might have some housing insecurity in some of these Native communities that can lead to multiple family members residing in one address for an undetermined amount of time. So addresses may be changing, addresses may be an ante for a couple of months and maybe a different location for another, and that can lead to confusion again about where the particular individual has registered and needs to actually go in order to participate in a polling place. Again, this sort of an issue can affect voting registration, but it can also, as you might gather, affect absentee ballots. You, I think, have heard that there are a lot of issues right now with absentee ballots, and who can collect them is one. And that is an ever-changing process right now and is affected and changing day by day, is different across every state. So ballot harvesting is an issue that we see in Native communities where you have Native people that are sharing a post office box and may think that one person can collect up ballots for a community and go turn them in. It's going to be very determined by state law and the ongoing situation with different court cases and appeals going on right now as to whether that practice will actually fit within requirements for absentee ballots this year. So that's a traditional fight that has been going on for a long time. And you really do need to check the different restrictions to determine if that is an appropriate practice for this election. Just a couple more. Voter IDs is always an issue in Native communities. Some tribal citizens use their tribal ID cards as their primary identification. Some of these cards may or may not have a photo. And as you may know, in some states, you need to present a photo ID. So there have been accommodations made for tribal citizens in a number of states. That may be that you need to produce multiple forms of identification, your tribal ID plus something else. It may be that your tribal ID will be accepted. You really have to check and determine what the situation is for the state where you're in. And lastly, voter intimidation. Some Native American communities have historically reported intimidation tactics that they see at polling places. One example is the stationing of a particular law enforcement officer near the doors of a polling place that might have the effect of causing hesitation to individuals that want to access that polling place. Those practices do still continue, and they can have the effect of suppressing the Native vote. So now on to what lawyers can do, what you can do. If any of those particular obstacles spoke to you and you think maybe you might want to help try to correct them or address them in Native communities, again, the number one recommendation right now is know the law. I'm not advocating for anyone to pressure anyone to vote. I'm not advocating for anyone to advocate for breaking any law. Please investigate the rules before you take action. But after you do that, if you still want to help, then I think the first thing, excuse me, just a minute. First thing will be, for me, checking on the voting plans for your close circle of family and friends. In Native communities, we do have tight circles and bands of people that historically will band together for all sorts of different issues. That may be immediate family, it may be extended more than immediate family. But if you're in one of those circles, then consider, first of all, just reaching out to make sure everyone has a plan to vote. You don't have to encourage them to vote a particular way. In fact, please do not do that. Please be nonpartisan, but encourage them to make a plan. Please do encourage them to vote early. As you have heard, we have a lot of factors that might this year make voting difficult or even make your first attempt at voting fail. So I, if it were me, would encourage my friends and family to make a plan to vote early, and that can give you an alternative, other chance to fix something if something happens. Next, maybe drop in casually some deadlines about when different parts of this process need to be accomplished. If you know the early voting dates or deadlines, if you know the absentee ballot deadline for returning or requesting ballots, that might be something easy to share. You can easily share the correct website for family or friends to access in order to check their registration or to request an absentee ballot. I would also check to make sure in Native communities that all of those individuals that want to go and vote in person take the appropriate precautions. As some or all of you may know, COVID-19 has hit Native American communities very hard, and it has particularly put a lot of our elders at risk. So please do make sure that if you have elders or others at risk that do intend to vote in person, that they're taking advantage of any of these options that are available, whether it be the drive-through voting or just gathering PPE to help them make sure that they're safe and that everyone around them is also taking the appropriate precautions. I already mentioned the absentee ballot return date, but just so you know, this is varying a lot by the state. And particularly in some of the states I know, you do have to return that ballot before Election Day. There are others that differ. But if returning before Election Day is your procedure, then you want to make sure that you have planned to get that accomplished so that you're not showing up to an electoral office or a polling place and trying to, by hand, turn in your ballot on Election Day and finding out actually you cannot do that. Another option, if you want to participate in helping get out the native vote, I would recommend that you check out nativevote.org. It's www.nativevote.org. That is a collaboration and initiative that's between the National Congress of American Indians and Election Protection that's helping to get out the native vote. They have posted all sorts of materials there that you can share. They have posted links for you to find state-specific information and where you can go to find the different procedures that apply to you. You can find the way to sign up as a polling worker. That's all great information, and you could spend all sorts of time talking about what's on there, but I'll just tell you, check that out if you want to find some way to participate in getting out the native vote through that method. This kind of backs up the staying calm and carrying on recommendation. Please kindly correct misinformation. There's a lot of misinformation going around. If you see someone sharing it, please be calm, but you might consider maybe sharing a link to the proper place where you can find the right information and the official websites for your county or state election officials. Signing up as a polling worker, we've already talked about, but I do want to say anyone with native language experience is particularly needed. As I mentioned, native language can be a barrier to the native vote, and if you have that skill, you are particularly needed. So please do sign up for election protection or sign up as a polling worker to be able to share that skill. You might consider, as you've heard, signing up as a notary. There are some states that are still actually requiring notarizations. Oklahoma has a weird hybrid process going on. Some people are doing notarizations. Some people are able to provide a copy of their tribal or photo ID. If you can't access a notary, I think you're going to have a hard time actually making a copy of your ID too, but there you go. That's one of the options they're presenting. But I know even in this COVID time, if you don't use this for current election issues, we have a lot of attorneys that are signing up to be notaries and remote notaries so that you can help individuals in a lot of different situations get the witnesses that they need. Again, please make sure that you take appropriate precautions and everyone that you're helping takes appropriate precautions. And lastly, I would say a good way for you to help in Native communities is just volunteering to disseminate information. people in Native communities may not have had the access that you've seen through the internet or other resources to information about what they need to do. There's a lot of that information that I mentioned on the Native Vote website, flyers that you can perhaps make copies of to just stick in a tribal place. And perhaps that could help some people that are frequenting those buildings. I do want to make sure you do check tribal regulations and rules. You can't always put information in all public places, but there could be community centers, elder centers, youth centers, where you could put or a poster or something that has just a link to where you go to figure out how to vote. Those are some ideas, and I'll turn it back to Estelle.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We've really got some very informative panelists here. I had one question for you, which is there a particular hotline or helpline that is designed to answer questions regarding Native Americans? Because I would imagine with, first of all, the special, there are a lot of special situations that are applicable, and also the language that might be a need. And if it exists, I think lawyers could probably be helpful.
Yes, there is. This is again part of the Native Vote initiative. So if you go to the nativevote.org website, you're going to find all of the information on the part of the election protection phone calling initiative that is really dedicated to Native American communities and issues. I can post that here in the chat in just a moment, but generally I would say look there first, and they're probably going to be the best resource for finding the call-in information for individuals that need to talk to someone about a barrier for a Native community.
That's great, thank you. And I guess I should ask Michelle the same question. Is there any particular dedicated hotline for problems of on disability?
So there are, if it's something that's really disability specific, honestly, probably the best thing you can do is get directly in touch with the organization in our network that's in your state or territory. They're going to be particularly knowledgeable about these types of issues and appropriate resolutions. That said, there is also, if you are deaf or hard of hearing, and you go to the National Association of the Deaf's website, they actually have an ASL video call hotline where you can actually video phone someone and speak back and forth in American Sign Language. And there's also some contact options through election protection that I think are helpful as well. If you, for any reason, aren't going to hop on the phone, and a lot of people think that's deaf and hard of hearing folks, but that could also be someone with anxiety, someone with autism, someone with any type of speech impairment, maybe a little more reluctant to get on the phone. You can actually text or chat through the website for election protection. I gave that one before. It's 866-OUR-VOTE. So you've got some different contact options there to make it work for you. But in terms of specific hotlines, the best thing you can probably do is contact our network directly.
Great. Let me jump in with a couple more details that I wanted to make sure people are aware of. As was mentioned, there are literally thousands of election jurisdictions in this country, and the rules are very particular, but also the rules for the uses of attorneys can be very particular, or the use of anybody to help at the polls. There are places where you have to be a resident of the state to be in any position at all, regarding poll worker, poll watcher, poll observer. I think the outside poll observers, it's pretty much anybody. But so that's something to check also with your local law and rules. And it can be a county issue rather than a state issue as well. So, there are different levels that you have to check. And then one other thing that has been left out here that people always ask, which is, what if you want to do litigation? And the answer is basically, from my point of view, don't bother, because the political parties and the public interest organizations are both up to their eyeballs in doing litigation and defending against litigation. They are, in many cases, extremely experienced litigators in this area. And if you feel you need to go into court for something, if you're doing something in person, and I know a lot of people aren't, but one thing that lawyers can often do is run into the local court or the local election board on an emergency basis. For example, asking that a polling place get extended hours because they opened a half hour late. So, I mean, it's that kind of thing. It's not the most challenging legal issues, but if you're hungry to get into court, that's the most likely way to do it, unless you're really networked into a lot of these litigation teams, which, as I say, are pretty well set by now. So that's my 2 cents. We have a question that I think all of you could answer from your own points of view, which is, are preventative steps being taken to address violence at the polls? So let me start with Bill, since he's sort of right in the middle of it, and then we'll move on.
Yes, a lot of it I can't talk about, but in the city of Chicago, we used to place a police officer in every one of our polling places. Chicago, we have 2,069 precincts. So that got to be very expensive and also in most places unnecessary. Instead, we now operate from our election board headquarters a dispatching system. We have several hundred off-duty Chicago police officers who are in plain clothes, but we give them a lanyard that says they are an investigator for the board. And we can radio dispatch them out to any location when there's a trouble. We tell our election judges, which again goes by various names, the officials for the board that check people in, if there's any problem, call 911 immediately, then call us, but we'll get our people out there. And one of the things we're attempting to do is having a lawyer, as part of the Chicago Bar program, have lawyers right along with our investigators. So when they show up the scene where there might be a problem, we have an investigator and an attorney there. Will hopefully bring the level of discourse more into civil tones. Yeah, we have some other contingency plans ready to launch if necessary.
Michelle?
Oh, that was a great answer. I think there's a lot being done to prepare for this. And when you work in the business of elections, you in any given year are thinking about anything that could possibly go wrong, and you have a plan A, B, C, D, E for it. I think sometimes when you don't hear that spoken about a lot publicly, I tend to believe that's not that the preparation isn't being happened. It's to not give anybody big ideas that maybe they should test that system. So some things like that, you just won't necessarily hear folks talking about it a lot. We don't want to encourage anyone to do anything that detrimental on election day. But in my experience, elections officials have a lot of contingency plans and give those kinds of things a lot of thought.
Jennifer, you have thoughts on that?
I don't have a whole lot to add other than the other comments. I think that there are plans in the process. If you see an issue, please do report it, as has already been talked about. Go to the primary official that's working that polling location. You can call 911. There should or may be law enforcement around. It really depends on the polling place, but there should be protections in place to keep everything calm and going forward in a peaceful way. And I think from everything I've heard, that's how things in early voting have gone in most places. So let's continue.
What about guns? In places particularly where there's open carry laws, has anything been done or is anything being contemplated about trying to calm down that situation? Anybody?
Well, in Illinois, all of our polling places are gun-free zones as well, except for licensed law, except for law enforcement. So again, especially since COVID-19, we had to move. As I said, we're continuing to move polling places right now. And because of social distancing, many of the polling places were small. So we have to go into larger areas, which are usually schools. Now, Chicago public schools are closed because of COVID-19. So we've been able to move a lot into schools where you have greater social distance, and they are all gun-free zones. So we're really not going to have a problem with that in Chicago with open carry. Actually, bouncing off something Michelle said, one of the things we're going to do, because we were working very hard to make sure all of our polling places were accessible. Now we've had to move so many of them. Any kind of help people can give us just to help escort people who might have some disabilities with regards to accessibility and things like that would be very, very helpful.
I feel bad for Chicago. Y'all have been working so hard to make all of your many, many polling places fully accessible. We've been following along as you guys have been working on that so hard. I feel so bad that some of that is being just kind of sidetracked by this. But I would agree. I think even in open carry states, there's still limits, right? Even in open carry state, that doesn't mean you can walk into a school and try to go to class with a rifle, right? And so polling places are one of those limits because we have laws against things like voter intimidation. So even in those open carry states, even in the most gun-friendly states, I would not plan to bring a weapon with you when you go to vote. That's still going to have repercussions. And I think for voters, these things are worth thinking about. We grapple with these kinds of questions every year, but by and large, it's safe to vote. And we anticipate it'll still be safe to vote this year. The worst thing you could do would be to forfeit your right to vote. Just because some of these concerns that are things that we can prevent and things we can deal with.
Well, I guess the question was prompted partly by how extreme the gun-toting crowd is this year. And I'm wondering if we've seen anything different. I mean, I know occasionally, I don't know. I from what you say, they're prohibited inside polling places, but a gun-free zone can only take you so many yards out. And I'm just wondering whether there's been an experience with any threats of violence or intimidation that we've seen, for example, outside the Michigan State House some months ago. Have we had any experience like that? Is that being anticipated?
I have not seen any reports of anything like that. Again, without giving away, without tipping our hand, we try to anticipate everything. So we have contingencies, and one of the things also, we don't want our polling places to look like a war zone. We don't want, and it's been suggested to us, let's put National Guardsmen in the polling places in uniform. No, we don't want that. We have contingency plans. We have, we're working closely with our law enforcement and other officials to make sure that we don't need to go to that step. So we're monitoring the situation, and you're never going to say that it's foolproof, because goodness knows we have a lot of fools out there. But we're doing the very best that we can.
Anybody else have any comments on that?
Same thing. Haven't really seen reports of that sort of activity. Certainly not an uptick of any of that type of activity. If that's something that really concerns a voter, that's when I really recommend leveraging your opportunities to either vote by mail or vote early. Early voting that's happening right now, it just gives you so many options for when you show up. And if you show up and experience something that makes you uncomfortable, you can leave, and you still have more days when you can come back and try again. So if it's something that a voter is really, really concerned about, they should definitely know and leverage the different options that are available to them. But in our experience, there's usually more fears about that type of thing than actual occurrences.
But I'd also suggest when they leave, or before they leave, they should report it, because sometimes those things really are illegal, and the authorities can break them up. I was going to ask you, Michelle, another question, which is you said very patly, if that's an adverb, that that polling places are gun-free zones. Now, does that mean you can't have one in a polling place, either open or concealed? And is that universal?
That might be a question for attorneys to test the limits of in court. I mean, I would imagine it would, in my mind, I'd love to hear Bill's opinion on this too. Imagine it would matter whether or not it kind of rises to a standard of voter intimidation. And that would be where the line is to me, but I'd love to hear some other thoughts on that.
Again, this goes state by state. In Illinois, when you have a gun-free zone, it's both open carried and concealed weapon is not allowed into the building, into the area. Other states may allow concealed if you're licensed for that. I'm not sure, but again, I think you need to check with your particular jurisdiction and see what is allowed there. Some states may allow it if it's concealed. I really don't know. I can't speak for all the states in the District of Columbia. Sorry.
That sounds right to me as well. Yeah.
Jennifer, any thoughts on that?
Oh, I think I'm probably the panelist that may have a jurisdiction where it is more free. I think as far as this goes in Oklahoma, you see very few restrictions on carrying into a polling place. But of course, I would recommend to anyone that has questions about it to check the local law and also make sure that you aren't conducting any activity that would rise to the level of voter intimidation. As far as I know, in many states like Oklahoma and others, you may not find a restriction on carrying either open or concealed.
In fact, one of our viewers just said that in Virginia, you can in fact carry a concealed gun into a polling place. So check your local jurisdiction and what their laws are.
I think this is one of the places where attorneys are actually really crucial as well, because, you know, some of those things are a little bit of a gray area. Like, does this constitute voter intimidation? These are the types of things that we figure out through legal precedent. And some of those determinations get made in a courtroom. So lawyers are incredibly important to that process. And just because it was allowed previously doesn't mean it'll be allowed in the future. If it's something that voters are really concerned about, and some clever attorneys make a good case there.
Yeah, and that segues nicely into another question we just got, which is how should voters wearing candidate paraphernalia be handled? And, you know, I think there's a general question of, if you're a lawyer operating outside a polling place, sort of looking, or even if you're not a lawyer, you know, looking things over, making sure people didn't have any terrible problems when they were in there, which I've been in that role a couple different times, and they say, just, you know, take some random people and say, how was your voting experience? Did you have any problems in there? That kind of thing. If you have problems like this, people not following the rules, and it's very obvious to you they're not following the rules, who is authorized? I mean, you're authorized to tell them, of course, but if they refuse to cooperate, who is authorized to say you have to get off of this piece of the property?
Okay, I'll speak for Illinois and for Chicago. The judges of election are in charge of the place, and we have we've had a lot of litigation with regards to what constitutes campaigning and what to do. Yeah, you shouldn't be wearing political paraphernalia into the polling place. Very often, as a practical measure, if someone walks in, and we especially saw that a few years back when our own native son, Barack Obama, was running for president. A lot of voters showed up with Obama t-shirts and such. Well, we're not about to tell them you have to take your shirt off before you can come in. But we have them come in, maybe send them to a voting booth that's a little further away, you know, so it wouldn't be so obvious, and then have them leave. Now, if somebody working the polls, a poll watcher or such, is wearing a political shirt, then the judges of election in charge of the polling place would probably tell that person, you can leave, or you can put a jacket or a sweater over it, something like that. But we're not going to allow political campaign materials or paraphernalia within the polling place.
Is it within the polling place or within the 100 feet?
Well, definitely within the polling place, and then within the campaign-free zone, which is 100 feet from the door into the polling place. And that itself has caused problems because we've had polling places in, say, apartment buildings or condo buildings, and the person with the condo above the entrance puts a sign in their window. Yeah, well, do we measure up? So we try to work these things out peaceably. I'll just put it that way.
That's very funny. Anybody else have anything to add to that aspect of the discussion?
I concur with everything that was said. I think in my jurisdiction too, that you're going to look to the polling workers, the official that's running that polling site, and they will try to resolve the situation peacefully. They may not specifically turn someone away that's wearing a t-shirt or a button if they're doing so peacefully, but that is a violation of campaigning laws. So please don't do it if you can avoid it, or stay within the zone of campaigning that you can be in, which is a certain number of feet away from the polling place. So take those things into consideration.
And please tell your campaign, and please instruct your campaign to instruct their workers likewise. I think that would be helpful. So do the poll workers actually sort of come out and survey things occasionally, or does somebody have to walk in and say, we need a poll worker out here, we need somebody in authority?
It's a little of both. We instruct our poll workers to every now and then, especially if it's slow, go out and take a look around. What we do now in Chicago, and I think I was kind of part of the reason we do that, every one of our 2,069 precincts, we supply a 100-foot string and blue cones, like you would see on a child's soccer game. And we place those out at 100 feet. And of course, we'll have people who will move the cones. So we have to go out and check on that. So they do that. Plus, if anyone comes in and notifies the election judges, our poll workers, they will go out. And if necessary, if they've planted signs on the lawn, we will remove the sign and such. That's why I like the idea of bringing some sidewalk chalk and marking the sidewalk nonetheless, because it's hard to, unless it's raining hard, that mark will still be there, whereas they might move the cones.
Yeah, there's an endless variety, I think, of things that can come up that I think, as Bill said, a lot of common sense is demanded here. I mean, there are places, for example, where the parking is terribly limited, and people who long-term park in places that are a polling place, and that day or that week or two, they really need every space they've got. And there's a lot of negotiation in that. See, there's another thing lawyers can do, is to try to work those things out. Some of it sounds pretty trivial, but it really can make a difference. And one other thing, and I'll let you talk in a second, Bill, is that there's sometimes big bullhorns or sound trucks and things like that go by a polling place, and they're incredibly disruptive and annoying. And sometimes they go by, and sometimes they stay there for a long time. So that's something else that I'm not sure it's a legal violation, but it's really, I think, either intimidating or at least unpleasant for voters. And, that's something else to try to fix. Bill. You're muted. You're muted. Bill. Bill.
I pushed the wrong button. Sorry, suddenly stuff was showing up on my screen. Yeah, it's well, fortunately in Chicago, we have a noise pollution ordinance, and we've had that situation. We send officials out there, we send police out there, and again, it doesn't matter what the message is, but if it's over a certain amount of decibels, we can shut them down, we can ticket them. So so we do have that ability, because yes, if you can imagine it happening in an election, it's happened in Chicago. I think we have more election lawyers in Chicago than anywhere else. So we'll be busy these next few weeks. I'd like to ask just a couple of things off of Michelle, because again, Chicago, we've been working real hard at making all of our polling places accessible. And Estelle, you were talking about parking. We try to reserve the spaces closest to the entrance for disabled parkers and things like that, so that they have access. But Michelle, you mentioned curbside voting. which is a very good idea. We'll send 2 election officials, one from each of the major parties, out to the car with the material so they can vote. What we ask is, and just to see if you agree with this, Michelle, we ask that people who are going to be doing that call the Chicago Board of Elections, tell us what polling place you'll be going to, and give us an hour, an estimated time you'll be there. Because as you say, Estelle, very often where the voting takes place is far removed from the curb. So if we know somebody's coming in between 10 and 10:30, we'll have one of our poll workers out there looking for that person. And we will inform that polling place to look for that. Do you encourage that, Michelle?
Yeah, for sure. We always encourage all voters, and especially voters with disabilities, to make a plan to vote and really think through all the logistics. It's unfair that voters with disabilities still have to do that in a lot of cases, but it is the reality, of where we're at in terms of making voting fully accessible. So in every place that curbside voting is offered is a little bit different. So for sure, calling ahead if you're able to can certainly make that process easier. Sometimes we recommend bringing someone with you if you can, because we have had people get into situations where you have to alert somebody inside that you're there. And if you can't get inside, you can't do that, right? So, and in some places there's, systems set up, there's some sort of like call bell, but you never know the day that call bell might be malfunctioning, right? And at a polling place, things can happen. So absolutely, we recommend kind of planning ahead and doing some of that legwork in advance, because nobody wants any surprises on election day.
So I have one quick question as a follow-up to that. It's a very practical question, and I then think we have to wrap it up and say our farewells. But Bill, is your phone line really accessible on election day? Because I think that's a problem.
It can be. It's funny. We will have periods of time when it's hard to get through, but just for short periods, maybe at the beginning of the day. Then we'll have hours where it's dead. We have what we call Election Central, where we have around 50 people sitting in a room with telephones in front of them. Most of them are attorneys, and the rest of them are our election board staff are well versed in this. We have it, the call comes in, it gets logged electronically. If there's need for an investigator to go out, we can dispatch it from there. We can follow up on it. We can contact a polling place. So I would say 98% of the time our people callers can get through to our Election Central. Those few times where they'll get it ringing for a while, hang up, call back in 5 minutes, you'll get through. So we've worked real hard to make sure that on election day, people can get through. And in fact, we have an early voting hotline that we've established, and we've been doing real well on that.
Well, as a member of our Standing Committee on Election Law, I think it would be very helpful if you wrote up something about best practices regarding some of those things, because that has been a problem that I've seen many times, that just when you need to get through, on an emergency basis to the election authorities, it's just impossible. So if you're doing things that way, if you're at 98%, you're winning that contest without a doubt. So let me just say, to wrap up, that we are very grateful for all of you for tuning in. I'm very grateful to our panelists who all had an awful lot to contribute, and we're very pleased. I also wanted to thank especially our staff, who never get any recognition. Selena Thomas and Allie Kielsgaard are both members of the ABA staff who made all this happen, and they're very patient with all of us who have technology issues, including me. As I mentioned earlier, the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice does lots of webinars, and lately a lot of them have been on voting issues. Regardless of what issue, you'll probably find something interesting there. So I urge you to look at the website. It's ambar.org/CRSJ. And we'd also love it if you would join the ABA and join the section and become active. We can use all the active volunteers we can get. And we are very grateful, and best of luck to you all in whatever you do for Election Day. I hope you will do something, and stay well. Thanks so much.